Welcome back to The Joy Report, a podcast dedicated to sharing climate solutions through the lens of intersectionality and optimism. This podcast is brought to you by Intersectional Environmentalist, an eco-media platform dedicated to sharing stories of climate solutions from an inclusive, intersectional perspective. Tune in for a dose of climate joy and actionable steps you can take to stay informed, engaged, and connected to the movement to protect people and the planet. I'm your host, Ariel V. King, an environmental justice strategist and educator passionate about making environmentalism accessible and irresistible. In today's episode, we're diving into the world of artificial intelligence, or AI, exploring the present and future impacts this technology has on people and the planet. The topic of AI is unavoidable in our current world and political landscape, and we want to take a moment to acknowledge the people and institutions working towards creating more equitable outcomes using AI and other machine learning technologies. To discuss this more, we have dylnbkr joining for today's episode. Dylan, would you mind just introducing yourself for our audience, please?
Yes, so my name is dylnbkr. I use they or he pronouns, and I am the lead research engineer at the Distributed AI Research Institute. Before that, I was doing ethics research at Google, and I'm sort of a data scientist and software engineer by training.
So Dylan, welcome to The Joy Report. Thank you so much for being here.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. I'm super stoked to be here.
Yay! So before we dive in, to our listeners, many of the questions I'll be asking Dylan today come from a DM that we received from a high school student named Eloise, who is working on a project about how excess AI usage affects our planet. So if you have questions or topics that you'd like to hear explored on the Joy Report, please feel free to send us a DM at Intersectional Environmentalist on Instagram, or send an email to hello@isxenvironmentalist.com with TJR submission as the subject line. All right, let's get into it. This is the question that we like to start every interview here on the Joy Report with. Dylan, how have you been creating joy for yourself lately?
I was thinking about this. I have been learning to dance as an adult.
Oh,
I never danced as a kid, and I always kind of wanted to. And I thought of it as something you just can't do as a grown up, but it has been so much fun. I've been doing a lot of social dance, like swing dancing and bachata and contact
cool.
improv has been really cool.
Love.
Yeah.
Okay. Oh, that's so fun. I love that so much. I'm experiencing joy just hearing about that. Dance is such an important experience, I think. And can you please share a little bit more about the work that you do at DAIR Institute?
Yeah. So I do a lot of different things. We're super small and still pretty young as an institute. So I'm working
Hmm.
across a lot of projects. I'm working on some engineering projects looking at language technology that's kind of distributed, federated, and run by people who are actually language speakers in particular regions.
Yeah.
It's one sort of big project. I'm also working on this possible futures angle of thinking about technology. So I've been running workshops and we're
Yeah.
working on kind of a blog series about how can we imagine otherwise in the world of tech.
Amazing. And we're going to dive into that a little bit more later in the episode. But for our listeners who hear the term AI all the time, but might not necessarily know exactly what it encompasses, what is AI?
That's an excellent question. So AI is sort of at its core kind of a marketing term. It doesn't
Hmm.
have a really specific definition. It emerged in the 60s and has meant a ton of different things in different disciplines. Most recently, it's come to talk about this kind of large scale generative AI, like text, text generators and image generators. But before that, it usually referred to machine learning approaches, pre 2022. But
Ah,
it's also had uses in robotics and all over the place.
okay, so that's helpful because I think a lot of people still just associate it with one type of mechanism or one function. So, yeah, that's really, really useful context. So, thank you. I also think that most people are afraid of the uncertainty or lack of clarity around what AI means for our future. So, would you be able to describe some of the ways that AI is currently harming the environment?
Yeah. So I think one of the big things is the scale of it.
Hmm.
So oftentimes we're thinking about the data centers that are involved in large scale. I'm talking about the post 2022
Right.
AI. And, for these models to run, they need a lot of really big computers. And these data centers that are getting built, the land and energy requirements are really huge. They use a ton
Hmm.
of potable water, and often these are
Right.
taken from like public water sources, even when drinking water might be limited for residents during drought.
Hmm.
There's the like copper and lithium mining, and so that can sometimes leave also environmental contamination that increases cancer rates in the areas that they operate. They're depleting resources and minerals, so people who are farming in these areas can no longer farm, which increases poverty. There's like all sorts of different kind of cascading effects from these being built. Um,
Sure.
yeah, Karen Howe also talks a lot about this in her recent book, Empire of AI, which I would
Mm,
love to plug. It's, I think, if you're just getting into this and you want to know like the full scale of how this all kind of fits together, this book is
yeah.
incredible.
Okay, thank you. We'll definitely add that to the show notes. Yeah, that's very helpful information. On the flip side, can you potentially share some examples of ways that AI can be beneficial for the environment?
Yeah. So I think this is somewhere where it's important to kind of differentiate between this most recent big giant model for everything, kind of generative AI, and what it's meant
Right.
in the past. Um, so I think, before the kind of 2020s, when we're talking about machine learning, we're talking about these mathy, model-y things like, decision trees and, supervised learning models and anomaly detection and, things like predicting how a chemical might break down or even
Mm-hmm.
spell check could be machine learning. And I
Sure.
think these more like kind of small energy efficient models that can run on like sometimes, a laptop or a one server that lives in a closet at a university can be incredibly powerful when they're scoped to specific use cases, usually within the sciences. Sasha Lucioni, who's a researcher who does a lot of work around climate, talks a lot
Hmm.
about this, about how this like smaller scale, more specific types of machine learning approaches can be really impactful in environmental science research. Um, and I think, in my opinion, I think what generative AI is doing right now has a lot more kind of harms than benefits when it comes to the environmental impact.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, one thing that we're seeing a lot of information about is like water usage. And yeah, which is something that you mentioned when you were talking about the harmful effects of AI or of this generative AI that we're seeing right now. For better or worse, we are noticing that companies are adopting and integrating AI into their business models. So, would you be able to share with our audience what are some actions that companies can take to continue AI production while reducing or stopping the harm that it causes?
Yeah. I think of this almost in the same way I might think about fast fashion.
Mm,
So like the problem I think is really a lot about the like sort of means of production and the scope that it's happening, the scale that it's happening at.
sure.
So, and I think we're seeing the same kinds of patterns where, a fast fashion retailer might say, oh, we're using, 50% recycled materials in our packaging. When what we really need to do is like rethink the whole way that we, you know, have clothing and repair it and, where it comes from and who's building it, where it goes when it
Yeah.
dies. So I think that same kind of thing could be applied to AI, that I think there's actually a lot of shifts or back steps that we could be making to have models that are task specific. Sorry, models that are very task specific, that are
Hmm.
geared towards, particular use cases, particular communities, and then could operate at a much, much smaller and kind of bespoke scale, if that makes sense.
That makes a lot of sense. And that would, most likely also provide a more equitable distribution of the burdens and benefits of these data centers, for example, which so far have been disproportionately harming low income and predominantly communities of color in the US. And we have another episode coming up with someone who's going to be talking about some of the ways that communities are fighting against some of these dirty data centers. And so this is a really, really excellent opportunity to set up that conversation. So again, just super excited that you're joining us today. So what steps can be taken to reduce the negative effects of AI, particularly for individuals?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest things that people can do and that I do are, resisting the usage of generative AI in a lot of the places where it's sort of being imposed upon us and educating other people about, why you might be choosing to do that. I
Uh,
think a lot of educators have been doing a really good job because I think a lot of them have been kind of forced into this position where they kind of need to overhaul how they're teaching and how they're talking to people about, the importance of education and the importance of the challenge and the friction that is the learning process.
yeah,
Um, so yeah, I think helping people to not only sort of resist AI where it's, not needed, which I think in most cases it's not, but also
sure.
to sort of convince themselves and other people that like our creativity matters, our writing matters, our learning process
Yeah,
is valuable. It's worth not outsourcing that.
absolutely. And we found that, a few researchers at MIT recently released a report that found that heavy ChatGPT users are experiencing severe cognitive atrophy, like 47% decreases in neural connectivity, people struggling to recall the content that they just generated, and severe dependency on this resource. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I'm not surprised. I've been seeing a lot of similar types of reports. And I think it's both, scary, overwhelming, but also a huge opportunity for, I think the same way that, a lot of people have kind of, got really into social media, could become very addicted to and dependent on and seen the negative impacts of social media, like excessive social media usage and have kind of swung back around to like, hey, how do I actually want to kind of thoughtfully engage with, my phone and with, I think a lot of people are, leaving the platforms and choosing a lot of more analog in-person ways of engaging with each other.
Yes,
And I'm really kind of hoping that in response to this reporting and people noticing this in themselves, that it's a chance for people to really rethink kind of the value of their own thoughts and the value of their own communication.
absolutely. One of the most fascinating and heartwarming trends that I've been seeing lately is preteens getting landline phones instead of cell phones.
I
So
love
yeah,
this.
I do too. I think it's so, so sweet and special. And yeah, I'm hopeful for what that will lead to in the future. And I guess as a follow-up to this, what does AI look like for people in the job market who are seeking jobs? A lot of people are using AI to create their cover letters, but also a lot of companies are using AI to filter out jobs and applicants. So should we be learning this technology? What would you suggest to someone who's either in the job market or who's trying to build their skills and strengthen their skills to be able to find other employment? Yeah, what would you suggest to someone who's like maneuvering through the job market at this time?
Yeah, I think this is a like almost a two-pronged kind of answer. I would give the
Sure.
kind of
Yeah.
answer that I sort of believe in, which I think is like, write your own cover letters or, like navigate things as much as you can through like networking and talking to real people and building relationships. Cause I find
Yeah.
in general, that's always been a really effective way, but that's not an option for everybody. And so I think on the other side, if it's like, okay, we like this is sort of the reality of the situation. Um, I'm usually an advocate for sort of building strategic kind of networks with other people. So if you know other people looking in the same types of markets for the same types of jobs, conspiring with each other, finding ways to kind of hack the system, finding out,
Yeah.
publishing and documenting and getting in the group chats about like, oh, I think this system's doing this thing and here's how we get around that. Yeah, I think it's an opportunity to be kind of like crafty and maybe antagonistic against some of these models that you kind of can't stop companies from using oftentimes. And also,
Definitely.
organizing to, outlaw the use of these types of things, I think is also a kind of long-term thing I'd advocate for.
Sure. But in the event that, you know, this technology cannot be escaped and it is just so interwoven into the way that we are living our daily lives. Do you foresee people being left behind in the job market if they aren't developing a level of awareness and understanding of how to properly use these technologies?
Yeah, I mean, I would expect it to follow the same kinds of patterns of like, it's very difficult to find employment, without a smartphone or a laptop, which I think a lot of
Sure.
people who are transitioning, out of being unhoused often fight because it's
Mhm.
very, very challenging. So I can imagine that playing out, but I really
Yeah,
have no idea. It still feels very early days.
very true. Very, very true. Um, Something that we talk about a lot on this show and in the work that intersectional environmentalist does is radical imagination and working to create worlds that we want to see. And so I'm wondering if you can share a little bit more about these possible futures workshop series that you are developing and leading at DAIR Institute.
Yes, I love talking about my little workshops. um,
Yes.
So these workshops have been focused on making these like collaborative zines. And so everyone
Oh,
comes together
wow.
for a couple of hours and we have a lot of different prompts that are designed to get people thinking like as non-reactively as possible. So it's like I want the most outlandish world building ideas that you can possibly come up with. And we make collages, we make poems, we make, I've had people do cryptic crosswords and have people do like fold out microzines within the zine. I've found it to be a kind of getting people in this kind of creative, sometimes even like uncomfortable space of like, what do you mean you want me to make a collage about the future? And I also, one of my favorite things to do in these spaces is to take magazines that are like often kind of super techy or, might be kind of very pro tech or very, in these angles that I can find frustrating. And people will do like blackout poetry in them. We're like reworking these existing materials to tell
Love
a
that.
completely different story.
Yeah, that is really cool. How often are these workshops taking place currently?
Currently, they're kind of ad hoc, so once every other
Okay.
month, but I'm really hoping to get them more consistently so we can have some kind of like monthly cadence potentially.
Yeah, that would be really special. And I'm sure a lot of our listeners would be excited to learn more and find opportunities to potentially get involved. Um, and so, one more question related to AI. How can we ensure AI is ethical and unbiased? And what does that access look like?
Yeah, I think this is a common question, and I think it can have a lot of different answers. Um, I often find that like any piece of technology, it's most helpful to think about like what tool are we building and what do we want it to do. So for example, I think like if you want to build language technology, you know, what do we actually want it
Yeah.
to accomplish? Well, okay, maybe we
Right.
want it to do medical translation. Okay, how do we get people to how do we ethically source, like medical specific conversations and how do we make sure people are compensated for that? And, you know, I think once you start to define what bias looks like in a particular context of like, oh, we want these different demographics and these different medical issues represented, then you can start to actually, use math or statistics or, sort of social science approaches to hone in on like, this is what we want to build for these people for this context. I think in
Right.
general, there's kind of no unbiasing something that doesn't have a goal really or doesn't have a specific use case that you're talking about.
Sure. That makes sense. And it sounds like this is another case of ensuring that there are as many diverse voices and perspectives at the table as possible to develop and strengthen this technology to ensure that at least everyone's perspectives are brought into the conversation. Um, and yeah, we're also curious, what do you think about AI consciousness at this moment?
I think, I have a lot of thoughts about kind of where this has emerged from and why it has taken
Okay,
such a hold in the public imagination. I
sure.
think it it is mostly a sort of a lot of what AI looks like, I think has emerged from the imaginations of a very small subset of people who've engaged
Sure.
with a very specific kind of worldview and very specific kinds of science fiction. And I think a lot of
Mhm.
times it's something, you know, in order to understand language, just as a human brain, we
Yeah,
model communicative intent on the other side. So if I'm going to read something in my brain at the most fundamental level, I am imagining that there is a speaker there, even if I
right.
happen to know like this was randomly generated. Um,
Mm.
And so there's this sort of subconscious thing that happens whenever we're engaging with these, that like on some level, some deep animal part of us believes that there is something there. And I think this is being sort of used as leverage to market these technologies as some kind of godlike figure that's going to, solve all of our fears and address all of our worries and become this thing that's going to, every problem that it's like, what about the environmental impact or the bias? They're like, well, it's going to become so smart and so huge and so great. It'll solve all of these problems.
Right.
Um, so I think it is mostly smoke and mirrors playing on the public imagination of sci-fi and some things about our cognition used to kind of market this and put it in everything. So I'm quite skeptical.
Yeah, I mean, and that makes sense. There are a lot of people who are using this technology as therapy right now and as friends right now. And so like hearing you say that this reminder that it's not a person behind a lens or behind anything that is developing these answers. It is literally just technology is valuable. I think it's a good
Yeah.
reminder.
Well, and I
Yeah,
also think it's important not to, because I think there's a lot of shame in it too, where people are like, oh, it's so stupid that I think this, or, it's so stupid that other people think this. And I really think it's important to kind of destigmatize and
sure.
normalize, like, it's a human thing to feel this way and respond this way.
Yeah.
And it also takes sort of an extra layer of being like noticing that in yourself and sort of correcting your own bias without sort of any kind of shame or judgment about having that initial response to it.
Definitely. And I don't know, like what suggestions would you have to someone who is seeking turning to this technology to solve their own loneliness?
I think it's complex. I think there are so many things that can lead people into situations of loneliness, a lot of which are societal and cultural. And,
Yeah,
it's such a personal thing. And, I could say something that feels almost trite of like, you know, go out into the world and find hobbies and talk to people, you know, get a therapist. It's all, I think, both meaningful and often harder than it sounds. But I think
definitely.
just armed with the knowledge that a lot of people feel this way, and when other
Hmm.
people feel similarly, there's sort of fertile ground to be connecting with others. So I'd hope that people who are turning to this out of loneliness can find one another and can find communities where, you can find kind of mutual support. But, I wish I had a better answer. It's hard.
No, I think that is the answer is yeah, these topics are complex and there is no clear answer right now. And it takes all of us being willing to investigate and ask questions and talk about it and share the information that we do know and allow people to help make more informed decisions. Um,
Absolutely.
yeah. And so who do you believe is accountable when these AI systems fail? Mental health or even, something like that? Or how can we support one another if and when they do fail?
I think these are kind of two separate questions. I think the accountability ultimately, we can it can fall on kind of legislative or governmental systems for not putting more guardrails in place into how these things are
Mm,
developed and deployed. I think you can put
sure.
accountability on the companies themselves because a lot of them fully know the issues. I was
Yeah.
an ethics researcher at a large tech corporation, and I
Hmm.
can tell you, from the inside, they could be doing a whole lot more. So I think accountability for sure lies there quite a lot. And in terms of, I think, supporting one another, I think one of the best things one can do is be talking to each other and be reflecting on yourself and your own experiences. Because I think
Yeah.
one of the biggest things this can take from us is trust in ourselves of like, oh, this is an
Mm,
expert thing. It knows everything about therapy. It knows everything about mental
right.
health, everything about everything.
Hmm.
And I think learning to question that, take a step back, talk to each other about your experiences can kind of demystify, and defang some of these kind of pernicious beliefs that cause us to
Sure.
kind of lose ourselves in it.
Definitely. Thank you. And so our final question that we ask all of our guests is what is something in the news or in your recent discoveries that has brought you joy lately?
Should this be like AI related or just something in
It
general?
absolutely doesn't have to be AI related. It can be any news, any recent discoveries that are bringing you joy.
I do actually have an AI related one.
Okay, yeah, let's hear it.
This so there's this researcher, Dr. Keolu Fox, whose work I
Mhm.
just sort of became familiar with. He's like a native Hawaiian researcher and has like 1,000 incredible initiatives. You should definitely look him up. But
Okay.
something that he has been working on is a kind of environmentally aware, like kind of end-to-end AI development ecosystem. And so he's building
Mhm.
these like micro data centers that are really inexpensive, that are reusing old kind of computer components. So we're not churning out more GPUs.
Love
Um,
that. Okay.
in these like little data terrariums that are, like renewably powered and localized, and they're using data that people are, you know, paid for and consenting to, and they're developing models like for their communities that are like, you know, helping people take ownership of their genetic data. And yeah,
Wow.
it's really cool to see people, reimagining what this kind of tech and landscape could look like, kind of coming from their own experiences and communities. So that's been something I've learned about where I'm like, hell yeah, this is great. I
Yeah,
love
no,
this work.
that's really exciting. So I think, in order for us to I think if there is an ethical divide about AI, I think there must be a way for us to help direct it towards something that is more just and more loving and more community oriented and more solutions oriented. So yeah, that's a
Absolutely.
really, really great example. Thank you for sharing that. Dylan, thank you so much for joining me for this episode of The Joy Report. And listeners, if you enjoyed listening or learning something from this episode, please share it with at least one friend and keep the conversation going by posting about it on social media and tagging us. Make sure that you're following Intersectional Environmentalist on Instagram, YouTube, and Substack so you don't miss any updates. And remember, fighting the climate crisis is a marathon and not a sprint. We need everyone to get involved in a way that feels right for them now more than ever. Our individual positive actions do have power, and they're strengthened when we do them as a collective. I'm your host, Ariel V. King, and thank you so much for listening to this episode of The Joy Report.